mountain slopes of Gilboa were about to become a graveyard. Across the valley, the Philistine army had gathered in terrifying strength. Israel's soldiers could see them. King Saul could see them, and for perhaps the first time in his reign, the man who had once stood taller than everyone around him seemed utterly powerless before what was coming. Samuel was dead. The prophet who had anointed Saul, corrected Saul, warned Saul, and finally declared God's rejection of Saul was no longer among the living. And soon on this mountain, Saul would die. His sons would fall with him. Israel would flee. The kingdom that had begun with such extraordinary promise would collapse into defeat. But the tragedy of Mount Gilboa did not begin on Mount Gilboa. It had begun years earlier when Saul still had victories ahead of him, when Samuel still stood beside him, and when the future of Israel's first king had not yet been sealed. To understand Samuel's final prophecy, we have to return to the warnings Saul heard long before that final night. Because the judgment announced at Endor was not a sudden sentence from an unpredictable God, it was the final declaration in a story of opportunity, instruction, fear, impatience, disobedience, and warning. And the first major fracture came at a place called Gilgal. Before Saul became a tragic figure, he had been the answer to a national demand. For generations, Israel had not been ruled by a permanent human monarchy. The nation had judges, priests, elders, and prophets. At moments of crisis, God raised leaders to deliver the people from enemies. But by the time Samuel grew old, Israel's elders wanted something different. They wanted a king. Their reasons were partly practical. Samuel's sons did not walk faithfully in his ways, and the surrounding nations were governed by monarchs who could organize armies and project power. But the demand also revealed something deeper. Israel told Samuel that they wanted a king to judge them and to go out before them and fight their battles. They wanted to be like the nations around them. Samuel was displeased, yet God told him to listen to the people. Their rejection was not merely a rejection of Samuel's leadership. The biblical narrative presents it as a rejection of God's kingship over them. Still, God permitted the monarchy, and Saul was chosen. At first glance, he looked exactly like the kind of king a nation would want. He came from the tribe of Benjamin. His father Kish was described as a man of standing. Saul himself was physically impressive, described as handsome and taller than anyone else among the people. Yet when Samuel first encountered him, Saul did not appear to be grasping for a throne. He had been searching for his father's lost donkeys. The future king of Israel entered the story looking for animals and instead encountered a prophet who already knew he was coming. Samuel anointed Saul privately. Oil ran over Saul's head as Samuel declared that the Lord had appointed him ruler over his inheritance. For Saul, the moment must have been overwhelming. He had not arrived seeking a crown. Now he had been told that he would lead Israel. Samuel gave Saul signs that would confirm what had happened, and those signs came to pass. Saul encountered a group of prophets. The Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and Saul prophesied among them. Something was happening. A new political era had begun. But from the beginning, kingship in Israel would never mean unlimited authority. Saul had been chosen to rule, but he was still expected to obey the God who had chosen him. The king would command soldiers. He would lead armies. He would make decisions affecting the entire nation. But he would not replace God. That distinction would become the central struggle of Saul's reign. When Saul was publicly selected before the tribes of Israel, the moment itself contained an unusual contradiction. The people wanted a king who looked strong enough to lead them, and Saul did look strong. Yet when the moment came to present him before the nation, he was nowhere to be seen. He had hidden himself among the baggage. The man who stood taller than everyone else was hiding. When he was finally brought forward, The people shouted, "Long live the king!" The monarchy had begun. But Saul's early years were not simply a march toward failure. That matters. If we remember only the Saul who hunted David, consulted the medium at Endor, and died on Mount Gilboa, we miss how tragic his story really is. Saul was capable of courage. When Nahash the Ammonite threatened Jabesh-Gilead, Saul responded decisively. The Spirit of God came upon him. He rallied Israel, and the Ammonites were defeated. The victory strengthened Saul's position as king. Samuel gathered the people at Gilgal, and the kingdom was renewed there. For the moment, Saul looked like exactly what Israel had asked for. A king who could gather the tribes. A king who could confront an enemy. A king who could deliver a threatened city. But success introduced a new test. Would Saul remain dependent on God when the pressure became greater? Would he obey when obedience required waiting? Would he trust God when the battlefield looked hopeless? The answer would begin to emerge when Israel again faced the Philistines. The Philistines were not a minor enemy. They were a major military force in the region and had long threatened Israel. The biblical account describes their forces gathering with chariots, horsemen, and troops so numerous that they were compared to sand on the seashore. The effect on Israel was immediate. Fear spread through the people. Some Israelites hid in caves, thickets, rocks, pits, and cisterns. Others crossed the Jordan to escape. Those who remained with Saul were trembling. This was not the atmosphere of triumphant kingship. The nation was frightened. The army was shrinking. The enemy looked overwhelming, and Saul was waiting at Gilgal. Samuel had instructed Saul to wait. The king waited 7 days according to the appointed time. But Samuel had not yet arrived, and every passing moment made Saul's position look worse. The people were scattering. The Philistine threat was growing. The king needed his army to stay together. He needed confidence. He needed momentum. He needed something that would make the men believe the battle could still be fought. This is where Saul's crisis becomes more than a military problem. It becomes a test of authority. What does a king do when obedience appears to weaken his position? What happens when waiting feels dangerous? What happens when the command of God seems less urgent than the pressure of the moment? Saul made his decision. He ordered that the burnt offering and fellowship offerings be brought to him. Then Saul offered the burnt offering, and almost immediately after he finished, Samuel arrived. The timing is one of the most painful details in the story. Saul had waited. He had watched his army begin to dissolve. He had finally acted, and then the prophet appeared. Saul went out to greet Samuel, but Samuel did not congratulate him for taking initiative. He asked the question that would expose the entire crisis. "What have you done?" Saul began to explain. The people were scattering. Samuel had not arrived at the appointed time. The Philistines were assembling. Saul feared that the enemy would come against him before he had sought the Lord's favor. Then Saul said something revealing. He explained that he had felt compelled to offer the burnt offering. From Saul's perspective, the decision could be made to sound reasonable. The army was disappearing. The enemy was approaching. Samuel seemed late. The religious ritual needed to happen. Something had to be done. But the narrative does not present Saul's action as courageous improvisation. Samuel called it foolishness. The problem was not that Saul cared too much about worship. The problem was that he treated obedience as something that could be adjusted when circumstances became uncomfortable. He had been given a command. Pressure came, and Saul decided that the emergency justified crossing the boundary. Samuel's response was severe. Saul had not kept the command given to him, and because of that, Samuel announced that Saul's kingdom would not endure. This did not mean Saul would fall dead that afternoon. He would continue to rule. He would fight more battles. He would experience more victories. He would sit on the throne for years. But something fundamental had changed. Samuel told him that the Lord had sought a man after his own heart and appointed him to leadership because Saul had not kept what the Lord commanded. At this moment, that other man was not named. David had not yet entered Saul's court. He had not yet fought Goliath. He had not yet become the warrior whose victories would make Israel sing his name. From Saul's perspective, the throne still belonged to him, but the future of his dynasty had been wounded. This was the first great warning. The monarchy that seemed so secure after the victory at Jabesh-Gilead was already unstable, and the reason was not Philistine military power. It was not a lack of weapons. It was not bad geography. It was not even the fear of Saul's soldiers. The deepest danger to Saul's kingdom was appearing inside Saul himself. He was beginning to respond to pressure by placing his own judgment above the command he had received. That pattern would become increasingly important. Because Saul's story is not the story of a man destroyed by one isolated mistake, Scripture will show him receiving further responsibility, further opportunity, further instruction, and further warning. Gilgal was serious, but it was not the final confrontation between Samuel and Saul. There was still another command ahead, another military campaign, another moment when Saul would be expected to obey fully. And this time, the issue would not be whether Saul could wait. It would be whether Saul could obey when victory itself tempted him to rewrite the terms of the command. For now, Samuel left Gilgal. Saul counted the men who remained with him. The king still had an army. He still had a crown. He still had battles to fight. To anyone watching from the outside, Saul's reign was far from over. But the future had already changed. The man who had once hidden among the baggage now stood at the head of a nation, and yet the greater test of kingship was proving to be something no battlefield could measure. Could the king remain under authority when he himself possessed authority? That question would follow Saul into every major crisis that came next. And soon after another victory, he would face Samuel again. This time there would be captured livestock, a defeated enemy king, a public explanation, and words from Samuel that would become some of the most remembered and most devastating words ever spoken to Saul. The first warning had told him that his dynasty would not endure. The next would strike directly at his own kingship. Saul had already been warned. At Gilgal, Samuel had told him that his dynasty would not endure because he had failed to keep the command given to him. Yet Saul remained king. He still commanded armies. He still fought Israel's enemies, and he was still given opportunities to demonstrate what kind of king he would become. That is what makes the next confrontation so important. Saul was not condemned because God gave him no chance to obey. He was given another command. This time, the instruction was unmistakable. And this time, Saul would not fail because fear caused him to act too soon. He would fail after victory. Samuel came to Saul with a message. The prophet reminded him that it was the Lord who had sent Samuel to anoint him king over Israel. That reminder established the order of authority before the command was even given. Saul wore the crown, but the crown had come from God. His position did not make him independent of the one who had placed him there. Then Samuel delivered the command concerning Amalek. The conflict reached back generations. According to the biblical account, the Amalekites had attacked Israel during the Exodus, striking the vulnerable as Israel journeyed out of Egypt. The memory of that hostility remained part of Israel's covenant history. Now Samuel announced that the time of judgment had come. Saul was to strike Amalek. The language of the command is severe, reflecting one of the difficult judgment narratives of the Old Testament. The text does not present Saul as launching an ordinary campaign for wealth territory or personal prestige. He is portrayed as carrying out a specific act of judgment under divine command. And that distinction matters because the central question of the story is not whether Saul can win the battle. It is whether he will carry out what he has been told. Saul gathered his forces. The army was counted. He moved toward the territory of Amalek. Before attacking, Saul warned the Kenites to separate themselves from the Amalekites because they had shown kindness to Israel during the journey from Egypt. Then the campaign began. Militarily, Saul succeeded. His forces struck the Amalekites across a wide area. The enemy was defeated. King Agag was captured alive, and this should have been the moment when Saul demonstrated that the warning at Gilgal had changed him. He had received a command. He had been given the power to carry it out. He had achieved military victory. There was no Philistine army terrifying his troops, no shrinking force pushing him toward panic, no missing prophet whose delay could become an excuse. Saul had won. But victory exposed something that defeat had not. Saul and the people spared Agag. They also kept the best of the sheep, cattle, fattened calves, lambs, and other valuable possessions. What they considered worthless, they destroyed. What they considered valuable, they preserved. The command had been clear, but Saul and the people began making distinctions of their own. And here the tragedy deepens. Partial obedience can look remarkably similar to obedience when viewed from a distance. Saul did attack Amalek. He did defeat the enemy. He did destroy much of what was there. A report written only from the battlefield might have called the campaign a spectacular success. But Samuel's concern would not be whether Saul had completed most of the command. The issue was whether the king believed he had the right to edit the command. That night, the word of the Lord came to Samuel. God declared that he regretted making Saul king because Saul had turned away and had not carried out his instructions. Samuel was deeply troubled. He cried out to the Lord through the night. This is an important detail. Samuel did not receive Saul's downfall with pleasure. The prophet had anointed him. He had guided him. He had confronted him. And now Samuel learned that Saul had again failed at the central requirement of his kingship, obedience. By morning, Samuel went looking for Saul, but before he reached the king, he learned something revealing. Saul had gone to Carmel, and there, according to the text, Saul had set up a monument for himself. Then he moved on toward Gilgal. The detail is brief, but its placement is striking. The man who had once hidden among the baggage was now erecting a monument in connection with his victory. Fear had not disappeared from Saul's character, but now another force was becoming visible. Self-importance, the need to preserve his position, the desire to control how the story of his reign would be remembered. When Samuel finally reached Saul, the king greeted him enthusiastically. "May the Lord bless you." Then Saul made an extraordinary claim. "I have carried out the Lord's instructions." From Saul's perspective, apparently the mission was complete. Amalek had been defeated. The king had returned victorious. The campaign had succeeded. But Samuel could hear something. Livestock. Animals that, according to Saul's declaration of complete obedience, should not have been there. Samuel answered with a question. If Saul had truly carried out the command, why could Samuel hear the bleating of sheep and the lowing of cattle? The sound of the animals became testimony against the king's explanation. And Saul immediately shifted responsibility. The troops had brought them from the Amalekites. They spared the best sheep and cattle. Why Saul supplied a religious reason. They intended to sacrifice them to the Lord. Everything else, he claimed, had been completely destroyed. The explanation was clever. What looked like disobedience could be presented as worship. The valuable animals had not been kept because of greed. They had been kept for sacrifice. At least that was the defense. But Samuel stopped him. The issue was not whether religious language could be attached to Saul's decision. The issue was whether Saul had obeyed. Samuel reminded him of where he had begun. Though Saul had once been small in his own eyes, he had become head of the tribes of Israel. The Lord had anointed him king. Then the Lord had sent him on this mission. Why, Samuel asked, had Saul not obeyed? Why had he rushed upon the plunder and done what was evil in the Lord's sight? Saul resisted the accusation. He insisted that he had obeyed. He had gone on the mission. He had brought back Agag. He had destroyed the Amalekites. The soldiers, he said, had taken sheep and cattle from the plunder in order to sacrifice them to the Lord at Gilgal. Again, Saul described a large amount of obedience. He went where he had been sent. He fought whom he had been told to fight. He won the battle. He destroyed much of what had been condemned. But the biblical narrative now confronts a dangerous idea. Can a person obey God in every area except the part he decides should be different, and still call that obedience? Samuel's answer would echo far beyond Saul's reign. He asked whether the Lord delights in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord. Then came the line remembered for generations. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen is better than the fat of rams. The statement is sometimes detached from its context and reduced to a general religious slogan. But here its meaning is painfully specific. Saul was attempting to use sacrifice to defend a decision that contradicted the command. Samuel rejected the logic completely. Worship could not be used to sanctify disobedience. A religious act did not become pleasing simply because Saul attached God's name to it. The king could not replace obedience with ceremony and expect the ceremony to erase the rebellion underneath it. Samuel continued. Rebellion, he said, was like the sin of divination and arrogance or presumption, and like the evil of idolatry. The comparison would become disturbingly significant later in Saul's life. Years afterward, when Saul could no longer hear the voice of Samuel and believed God was no longer answering him, he would seek forbidden spiritual counsel at Endor. But that night still lay far ahead. Here at Gilgal, Samuel was already identifying the deeper problem. Saul had begun acting as if his own judgment could stand beside or above the command he received. Then Samuel pronounced the sentence. Because Saul had rejected the word of the Lord had rejected him as king. This was more severe than the earlier warning. At the first Gilgal crisis, Samuel had declared that Saul's dynasty would not continue. Now the judgment touched Saul himself. He had been rejected as king. The throne would not pass securely through his family. And Saul's own status before God had been fundamentally altered. Only now did Saul admit that he had sinned. He acknowledged that he had violated the command and Samuel's instructions. But his confession immediately revealed another fear. He said that he had been afraid of the people and had listened to them. That admission takes us to the heart of Saul's kingship. Israel had demanded a king who would lead the people. But Saul had become a king who could be ruled by the people's approval. If his explanation was true, then the soldiers had influenced the king's obedience. If it was merely an excuse, then Saul was again shifting responsibility. Either way, the problem remained. A king who had been appointed to lead Israel had allowed human pressure to become more powerful than the command he received. Saul asked Samuel to forgive his sin and return with him so that he could worship the Lord. Samuel refused. He repeated the judgment. Saul had rejected the word of the Lord. The Lord had rejected Saul as king over Israel. Samuel turned to leave. Saul reached for the edge of Samuel's robe. The fabric tore. And Samuel immediately transformed the moment into a sign. The kingdom of Israel, he said, had been torn from Saul and given to a neighbor of his, a man better than he. The future successor was still unnamed in Saul's hearing. But the transfer had been declared. The kingdom Saul desperately wanted to preserve would belong to someone else. Then Samuel emphasized that this judgment would not be manipulated like a human political decision. The glory of Israel would not lie or change his mind like a man who makes a decision and then reverses it for convenience. Saul again acknowledged his sin, but now his request exposed what mattered most to him in that immediate moment. He asked Samuel to honor him before the elders of his people and before Israel. The king had just heard that his kingdom had been torn away, yet he was still concerned with how he appeared publicly. Samuel ultimately went back with Saul, and Saul worshipped. But the unfinished command concerning Amalek still remained. Agag was alive. Samuel ordered that the Amalekite king be brought to him. Agag approached, apparently believing that the danger of death had passed. It had not. Samuel declared judgment concerning the suffering Agag's violence had caused, and Samuel executed him before the Lord at Gilgal. The scene is severe. It also leaves no ambiguity about the contrast between Saul and Samuel. What Saul had spared, contrary to the command, Samuel completed within the judgment narrative. Then the two men separated. Samuel went to Ramah. Saul went to his home at Gibeah, and the biblical account records one of the saddest lines in their relationship. Samuel did not go to see Saul again for the rest of his life. Yet Samuel mourned for him. The prophet's separation was not indifference. Samuel grieved. He had watched the first king of Israel begin with extraordinary opportunity. He had watched Saul rally a nation and deliver Jabesh-Gilead. He had watched the king face enemies, and now he watched the reign move toward tragedy. The Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Saul still occupied the throne. He still possessed royal guards. He still had sons. He still controlled armies. But from this moment forward, the story would increasingly revolve around a reality Saul could not see and would soon be unable to tolerate. God was preparing someone else. Samuel's mourning could not continue forever. The command came for the prophet to fill his horn with oil and go to Bethlehem. There among the sons of Jesse, a new king had been chosen. Samuel feared that if Saul learned what he was doing, Saul might kill him. That fear alone shows how much had changed. The prophet, who had once gone out to meet a humble Benjamite searching for donkeys, was now being sent secretly to anoint Saul's successor. At Bethlehem, Jesse's sons passed before Samuel. The first looked impressive enough that Samuel thought the Lord's anointed might be standing before him. But God corrected the prophet's instinct. Human beings look at outward appearance. The Lord looks at the heart. The irony is impossible to miss. Saul had originally impressed Israel with his appearance. He was tall, handsome, visibly king-like. Now Samuel was being taught not to choose Saul's successor by the same outward standard. One son after another passed before him. None was chosen. Finally, Samuel asked whether Jesse had any other sons. There was one more, the youngest. He was outside keeping the sheep. David was summoned, and when he entered, the Lord told Samuel to rise and anoint him. Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed David in the presence of his brothers. From that day, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Then Samuel returned to Ramah. The transfer declared at Gilgal had begun, but Saul did not surrender the throne. He did not know that a shepherd from Bethlehem had just been anointed. And David did not march immediately toward a palace demanding his crown. For a time, two realities existed side by side. Saul was still the publicly reigning king. David was the secretly anointed king-to-be. That tension would shape everything that followed. Soon David would enter Saul's world. He would soothe the troubled king with music. He would confront a Philistine giant. He would become a celebrated warrior. He would become close to Saul's son Jonathan, and the people would begin singing about his victories. Every success David experienced would force Saul to confront the prophecy Samuel had already spoken. The kingdom had been torn from him. It had been given to another. Saul could not yet see the end, but he was about to meet the man who represented it. And when he did, the king, who had once feared losing his soldiers, would begin fearing something even more: the loss of his throne. David entered Saul's story quietly. He did not arrive with an army. He did not stand at the gates of Gibeah claiming a throne. He did not publicly announce that Samuel had anointed him. At first he entered the king's presence as a servant. Saul, meanwhile, was beginning to experience the consequences of a reign that still looked powerful from the outside, but had already been rejected at its foundation. The biblical narrative describes Saul as increasingly troubled. His servants noticed his distress and suggested finding someone skilled with the lyre, whose music might bring relief. One servant knew of a young man from Bethlehem, David, the son of Jesse. He was known as a skilled musician. He was also described as courageous, capable, and a man of war, though his greatest military fame still lay ahead. Saul sent for him, and so the man Samuel had secretly anointed entered the household of the king Samuel had publicly rejected. Neither man's full future was visible yet. David played. Saul found relief. The king grew fond of the young man and made him one of his armor-bearers. For a time, David's presence was not a threat. It was a comfort. But that would not last, because the Philistines returned. Their armies gathered for battle, and this time one warrior stepped forward to dominate the confrontation: Goliath of Gath. For 40 days, according to the biblical account, he came out to challenge Israel. His size, armor, weapons, and confidence made him a terrifying symbol of Philistine strength. He demanded single combat, one man from Israel against him. The defeated warrior's people would serve the victors. Israel heard the challenge. Saul heard it, and the army was afraid. The king, who had been chosen partly because Israel wanted someone to go before them in battle, did not step forward. Neither did Israel's experienced soldiers. Then David arrived. He had not come as a champion. He had been sent by Jesse to bring provisions to his brothers and to learn how they were doing. But when David heard the Philistines' challenge, he reacted differently from the men around him. Where others saw an unbeatable warrior, David saw a man defying the armies of the living God. Word of David's confidence eventually reached Saul. The king looked at the young man before him and saw someone who appeared completely mismatched against Goliath. Saul warned David that he was only a youth, while Goliath had been a warrior from his youth. David answered by describing what had happened while he protected his father's sheep. A lion had come. A bear had come. David had fought them. He believed the God who had delivered him then would deliver him from the Philistine now. Saul finally gave permission. He offered David his armor. David tried it, but could not move naturally in equipment he had not tested. So he removed it. He went toward Goliath with a staff, a sling, and stones selected from the stream. The scene could hardly have looked more unequal. A heavily armed Philistine champion, a young shepherd, an army watching, a king waiting. And somewhere behind all of this stood a prophecy Saul did not yet understand. The kingdom would be given to another. Goliath mocked David. David answered that the battle belonged to the Lord. Then the confrontation ended with astonishing speed. David ran toward the battle line. He placed a stone in the sling. He released it. The stone struck the Philistine in the forehead. Goliath fell. David took the giant's own sword and completed the victory. The Philistine army broke. Israel pursued. A national humiliation became a national triumph. David had done what no one else had been willing to do. And from that day, Saul's relationship with him began moving towards something far darker than royal favor. The problem was not merely that David had won. The problem was that the nation noticed. Women came out from Israel's towns, celebrating the victorious army. They sang of Saul's victories, but they also sang of David's. Saul had struck down thousands. David, they sang, had struck down tens of thousands. The song was not a constitutional declaration. It did not place David on the throne. But Saul heard comparison, and in Saul's mind, comparison became danger. He became angry. What more, he thought, could David receive except the kingdom? That question reveals how deeply Samuel's warning had entered Saul's consciousness. Saul knew the kingdom would not remain with him. Samuel had told him that it had been torn away and given to someone better than he. Now Saul was watching a young man rise with extraordinary speed. David was courageous, victorious, loved by the people, close to the royal family, and successful in everything Saul entrusted to him. From that day forward, Saul watched David with suspicion. The king had found the man he feared might be his replacement. But instead of asking whether Samuel's warning was being fulfilled because of his own disobedience, Saul increasingly treated David as the problem. This would become one of the defining features of his decline. Saul could not reverse the prophetic judgment by eliminating the person through whom it might be fulfilled. Yet again and again he would try. The next day, while David played music, as he had done before Saul held a spear in his hand, the young musician had once brought relief to the king. Now the king looked at him and saw a rival. Saul hurled the spear. David escaped. Saul tried to pin him to the wall. He failed, and the relationship crossed a line. Saul was afraid of David. The text explains why. The Lord was with David, and Saul recognized that the Lord had departed from him. This was a terrifying reversal. Saul still had the title. David had the divine favor Saul had once experienced. Saul still had the palace. David had the future. Saul still had the army. But he was beginning to understand that the greatest thing he had lost could not be restored through political maneuvering. So Saul removed David from his immediate presence and placed him over military forces. Perhaps distance would reduce the threat. Perhaps the battlefield would kill him. Perhaps David's success could be controlled. Instead, David continued to prosper. He went out and came in before the people. He behaved wisely, and Israel and Judah loved him. Every success intensified Saul's fear. The king's strategy then became more calculated. Saul offered David his daughter Merab in marriage, linking the offer to military service. David responded with humility, questioning whether he was worthy to become the king's son-in-law. The arrangement did not happen as expected. Then another possibility emerged. Saul's daughter Michal loved David. When Saul learned of it, he saw an opportunity. The marriage could become a trap. Saul required a dangerous bride price, connected with the Philistines, expecting David to die attempting to obtain it. But David succeeded. He returned alive. He married Michal, and Saul's plan produced the opposite of what he intended. David was now even more closely connected to the royal household. The more Saul tried to control the threat, the stronger David's position seemed to become. And the text says Saul became David's enemy continually. This was no longer a moment of jealousy. It was becoming a state of mind. Saul had begun organizing his decisions around preventing a future Samuel had already declared. Then he went further. Saul told his son Jonathan and his servants that David should be killed. But Jonathan loved David deeply. Their friendship had become one of the most important relationships in the story. Jonathan did not treat David merely as a rival for his father's dynasty. He warned David. Then he spoke to Saul. Jonathan reminded his father that David had served him faithfully and had risked his life against Goliath. Israel had rejoiced in that victory. Why Jonathan asked, should Saul sin by shedding innocent blood? For a moment Saul listened. He swore that David would not be put to death. Jonathan brought David back. David again served in Saul's presence. It looked as if the crisis might be over. But the underlying fear had not been healed. War came again. David again fought the Philistines. David again won. And once more Saul sat with a spear while David played. Once more the weapon flew. David escaped. The spear struck the wall. The pattern was becoming impossible to dismiss. David's victories were not reassuring Saul. They were provoking him. Every success of David reminded Saul that his own future was slipping away. David fled to his house. Saul sent men to watch it and kill him in the morning. But Michal warned her husband, if David did not escape that night, she said, he would be dead by morning. She helped him down through a window. David fled. The king's own daughter had now protected the man Saul wanted to kill. Family politics, prophecy, and fear were becoming entangled. Where could David go? He went to Samuel. That choice is significant. David fled from the king who wanted him dead to the prophet who had anointed him. He found Samuel at Ramah and told him what Saul had done. David and Samuel went to Naioth. When Saul learned where David was, he sent men to capture him. But the messengers encountered a group of prophets, with Samuel standing as their leader, and the Spirit of God came upon Saul's men so that they prophesied. Saul sent another group. The same thing happened. He sent a third. Again they prophesied. Finally Saul went himself, and Saul also began to prophesy. The scene carries a powerful irony. Early in Saul's story, prophetic signs had confirmed his calling. People had once asked in amazement whether Saul too was among the prophets. Now, years later, Saul again found himself overwhelmed in a prophetic setting. But this time, he had come to capture the man Samuel had anointed to replace him. The king could not simply force his way through the prophetic world and seize control of his future. For the moment, David escaped. But Saul's hostility did not disappear. David turned to Jonathan. He wanted to know what he had done. What crime had he committed? Why was Saul seeking his life? Jonathan initially struggled to believe that his father would act without telling him. But David understood the danger. Saul knew Jonathan loved David. That was precisely why Saul might hide his intentions from his son. David described his situation in stark terms. There was only a step between him and death. Jonathan agreed to test Saul's intentions. The result removed any remaining uncertainty. When Saul realized David was absent from the royal table, his anger erupted. Jonathan defended his friend. Saul turned his fury against his own son. He accused Jonathan of choosing David to his own shame and to the shame of his mother. Then Saul revealed the political logic driving his rage. As long as the son of Jesse lived, Saul told Jonathan, neither Jonathan nor Jonathan's kingdom would be established. Saul knew what was at stake. The issue was succession, dynasty, the future of the throne. Samuel's prophecy had declared that Saul's kingdom would not continue. Now Saul was trying to save that kingdom through violence. Jonathan still refused to cooperate. He asked why David should die. What had he done? Saul hurled his spear at Jonathan. The king was now willing to strike his own son because Jonathan stood between him and David. Jonathan left in anger and grief. He understood that Saul had determined to kill David. Then came the painful farewell between David and Jonathan. Jonathan went out to the field where David was hiding. The two renewed their covenant. Jonathan understood that David's future was greater than Saul wanted to admit. He asked David to show covenant loyalty toward his family. David bowed. They wept together. Then they separated. Jonathan returned to the city. David entered the life of a fugitive. From that point forward, Saul would devote enormous energy to hunting a man who repeatedly refused to seize the throne by force. This is one of the great ironies of the story. Saul feared David would kill him and take his kingdom. Yet when David later had opportunities to kill Saul, David refused. At Nob, David received help from the priest Amalek, who did not understand the full conflict between Saul and David. He gave David bread and the sword that had belonged to Goliath. But one of Saul's servants, Doeg the Edomite, was present. He saw what happened. Later, when Saul learned that David had received assistance, the king interpreted it as conspiracy. He accused his servants. He accused Jonathan. He saw enemies around him. Doeg told Saul what he had witnessed. Ahimelech was summoned. The priest defended David. As far as he knew, David had been among Saul's most loyal servants. But Saul ordered the priests to be killed. Saul's own guards refused to strike the priests of the Lord. Doeg did not. He carried out the order. The violence extended to Nob, the city of the priests. Only Abiathar escaped and fled to David. The tragedy reveals how far Saul had moved from the beginning of his kingship. The king who once delivered Jabesh-Gilead from an enemy was now destroying an Israelite priestly community because of his obsession with David. The greater Saul's fear became the more destructive his attempts to secure himself became. And still David did not disappear. When the Philistines attacked Keilah, David asked the Lord whether he should fight them. He went. He saved the town. Saul heard that David was there and believed God had delivered David into his hand because David was inside a fortified city. But David sought guidance again. He learned that the people of Keilah would eventually surrender him to Saul. So David escaped. Saul pursued him through the wilderness. Again and again David remained just beyond his reach. At one point Saul seemed close to capturing him, but a messenger arrived reporting a Philistine attack. Saul had to break off the pursuit. The enemy Israel's king was supposed to fight interrupted the king's pursuit of the Israelite who had just been fighting Israel's enemies. The irony could hardly be sharper. Then came a moment in the wilderness of En-Gedi that exposed the difference between Saul's fear and David's restraint. Saul entered a cave to relieve himself. He did not know David and his men were hiding farther inside. David's men saw what appeared to be providence. Here was Saul, alone, vulnerable. The king hunting David had entered David's hiding place. David could end the pursuit with one blow. Instead, he secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Even that troubled David's conscience. He refused to strike the Lord's anointed. When Saul left the cave, David came out and called after him. He bowed. He showed Saul the piece of robe. He demonstrated that he could have killed him, but had refused. David asked why Saul listened to those who claimed David wanted to harm him. The evidence was literally in David's hand. He had been close enough to cut Saul's garment. He had chosen not to cut Saul down. For a moment, Saul's defenses collapsed. He wept. He acknowledged that David was more righteous than he was. And then Saul said something remarkable. He told David that he knew David would surely become king. The future Samuel had announced was no longer merely a hidden possibility. Saul himself spoke it aloud. He asked David to swear that he would not destroy Saul's descendants or erase his family name. David swore. Then the men separated again. But even this moment of clarity did not permanently change Saul. That is what makes his tragedy so profound. At several points, Saul seems to recognize the truth. He knows David will be king. He knows David has treated him better than he has treated David. He knows Samuel's judgment cannot simply be ignored. Yet recognition does not become lasting repentance. Fear returns. The pursuit continues. And then the biblical narrative delivers a short sentence that changes the emotional landscape of the entire story. Samuel died. All Israel gathered to mourn him. They buried him at his home in Ramah. The prophet who had stood at the center of Israel's transition into monarchy was gone. Samuel had seen Saul before Saul wore a crown. He had poured oil over his head. He had presented him to Israel. He had prayed for the nation. He had confronted the king at Gilgal. He had rebuked him over Amalek. He had declared that the kingdom would be torn away. He had mourned for Saul, and he had secretly anointed David. Now Samuel was dead. For David, the death removed the prophet to whom he had once fled. For Israel, it was the loss of a national spiritual leader. But for Saul, Samuel's death carried another weight. The voice that had repeatedly confronted him was gone. At least that was how it appeared. The king still sat on the throne. David was still alive, somewhere beyond his reach. Jonathan remained caught between loyalty to his father and covenant friendship with David. The Philistines remained a constant danger. But a boundary had been crossed. Samuel would never again walk into Saul's court. Never again meet him at Gilgal. Never again seize the king's excuses and expose them face to face. The final conversation between Samuel and Saul seemed already to belong to the past. It did not. One day, when Saul stood terrified before the greatest Philistine threat of his final years, he would desperately want to hear guidance. He would seek an answer and receive silence. Then, in the darkest decision of his reign, Saul would try to hear Samuel's voice one more time. But before that night came, the king who had lost Samuel still had farther to fall. And the Philistines were preparing to gather for a battle Saul would not escape. Samuel was dead. Israel had mourned him. His body had been buried at Ramah. But the consequences of everything Samuel had spoken were still moving forward. Saul remained king. David remained alive. The Philistines remained dangerous, and the judgment pronounced at Gilgal had not disappeared simply because the prophet who delivered it had gone to the grave. For Saul, Samuel's death did not bring peace. The old prophet was no longer there to confront him. But neither was there any sign that the sentence against his kingdom had been reversed. Saul still possessed what everyone could see: the throne, the crown, the army, the royal household. But the future Samuel had announced continued to close around him. Even after Saul had admitted that David would become king, his fear returned. The pursuit resumed. Once again, Saul went after David with thousands of chosen men. Once again, David had an opportunity to kill him, and once again, David refused. This time, Saul was sleeping inside the camp, surrounded by soldiers. His spear was planted in the ground near his head. David and Abishai approached during the night. To Abishai, the opportunity looked decisive. Saul was vulnerable. One strike could end the pursuit. But David would not permit it. He refused to take Saul's life. Instead, he took the spear and water jug beside Saul's head and withdrew. From a distance, David called out. He showed Saul that once again he had been close enough to kill him. Once again, he had chosen mercy. And Saul once again admitted his wrong. He called David his son. He said he had sinned. He acknowledged that he had acted foolishly. Then he blessed David and declared that David would do great things and surely prevail. They separated. And that was effectively the end of Saul's pursuit of David recorded in this part of the story. But David no longer trusted the cycle. Saul had confessed before. Saul had wept before. Saul had admitted David's righteousness before, and then he had hunted him again. So David made a disturbing decision. He concluded that one day Saul would eventually succeed in killing him. The safest place, he believed, was beyond Saul's reach in Philistine territory. David crossed over with his men to Achish, king of Gath. When Saul learned that David had fled there, he stopped searching for him. The future king of Israel was now living among Israel's enemies. The reigning king of Israel was losing the man who had repeatedly fought those enemies on Israel's behalf. Nothing about the kingdom was healthy. And then the Philistines prepared for war on a scale that would bring the crisis to its final stage. Their forces gathered. The confrontation was no longer a raid or a limited clash. This was a major campaign. The Philistines assembled at Shunem. Saul gathered Israel and positioned his forces at Gilboa. The geography placed the two armies within sight of a battlefield that would soon decide the fate of Israel's first king. Imagine the contrast. Across the valley stood an organized Philistine force. Behind Saul stood the army he was expected to lead. Years earlier, Israel had asked for a king who would go out before them and fight their battles. Saul had once done exactly that. He had rallied Israel against the Ammonites. He had led military campaigns. He had been a formidable warrior. But when Saul saw the Philistine camp now, the biblical account says he was afraid. Not slightly concerned, not merely cautious. He was terrified. His heart trembled greatly. The tall king who had once inspired a nation now looked across the battlefield and saw something he believed he could not overcome. Fear had been part of Saul's story for years. Fear of losing soldiers. Fear of losing public approval. Fear of David. Fear of losing the throne. But this fear was different. Now the enemy was in front of him. Samuel was gone, David was gone, and Saul needed an answer from God. So Saul inquired of the Lord. That detail is important. Before he turned toward Endor, Saul first sought an answer through legitimate means. The narrative says that the Lord did not answer him. Not by dreams, not by Urim, not by prophets. Each source of guidance Saul might have hoped to receive remained silent. The text does not give us a long scene describing Saul's prayers. It does not tell us precisely how long he waited. It does not record the questions he asked. It simply gives us the terrifying result: no answer. For a man who had spent years resisting prophetic correction, divine silence now became unbearable. Samuel had once spoken to Saul clearly. At Gilgal, Samuel had told him that his dynasty would not continue. After Amalek, Samuel had told him that the Lord had rejected him as king. Samuel had told him that the kingdom had been torn from him. Those words had been painful, but they had been words. Now Saul wanted guidance, and the voices were silent. There is a terrible irony here. For years, Saul had possessed something many people desperately desire: clear warning. He had been told where he was wrong. He had been confronted. He had been given opportunities to respond. But Saul repeatedly resisted the message. Now, when an enemy army stood before him and he desperately wanted a new word, no new word came. The silence did not mean Saul had never been told what mattered. In many ways, he had already been told. That is what makes the moment so heavy. Saul was not standing at Gilboa as a man who had never heard from God. He was standing there as a man haunted by what he had already heard. The king looked for an answer, and heaven seemed silent. Then Saul made the decision that would lead to his final conversation with Samuel. He turned to his servants and gave them an order. "Find me a woman who is a medium, so that I may go to her and inquire of her." The request was extraordinary for another reason. Saul himself had previously removed mediums and spiritists from the land. The biblical text specifically reminds the reader of this before describing the events at Endor. This was not a practice Saul could honestly claim to know nothing about. He knew it was forbidden. He had enforced its removal. Yet now the king who had driven such practitioners from the land wanted his servants to locate one for him. The contradiction reveals how desperate he had become. When Saul believed that proper channels were not giving him the answer he wanted, he began searching for a forbidden channel. It was Gilgal in another form. Years earlier, Saul had been told to wait. Pressure increased. The people scattered. Samuel did not arrive when Saul expected, so Saul crossed a boundary and justified it by the emergency. Now the pattern returned, with far greater darkness. Saul sought the Lord. No answer came. The Philistines were near. Fear was consuming him. So Saul again decided that the crisis allowed him to cross a boundary. The circumstances had changed. The pattern had not. When obedience became painful, Saul searched for another path. His servants had an answer almost immediately. There was a woman at Endor who practiced as a medium. Endor lay in a dangerous location for Saul. To reach it from his position, he would have to move through territory near the Philistine forces. The king of Israel would travel at night toward forbidden counsel, while the enemy army waited nearby. Saul could not go openly. He was too recognizable, so he disguised himself. The man who once stood a head taller than the people now tried to hide his identity. There is an almost tragic symmetry in Saul's life. At the beginning of his kingship, when Israel searched for him at the public selection, Saul was hiding among the baggage. Now, near the end of his reign, Saul was hiding again. But the reasons were completely different. Then he had seemed overwhelmed by the idea of kingship. Now he disguised himself because the king of Israel was about to violate a prohibition associated with his own reign. Saul removed his royal garments. He put on other clothing. 2 men accompanied him, and under the cover of darkness they went to the woman. The journey itself must have carried enormous risk. Philistine forces were in the region. Israelite troops waited for battle. The king should have been preparing his army. Instead, Saul was moving secretly through the night. No procession, no royal announcement, no army around him. Only a disguised king, 2 companions, and a desperate purpose. When they reached the woman, Saul asked her to practice divination for him and bring up the person he named. But the woman was cautious. She reminded him of something Saul knew better than almost anyone. Saul had removed mediums and spiritists from the land. Why, she asked, was this stranger setting a trap that could lead to her death? The disguised king now faced the consequences of his own policy. He wanted the very thing he had outlawed. So Saul reassured her. And then the scene becomes even more disturbing. Saul swore to her by the Lord that she would not be punished for doing what he was asking. The name of the Lord was being invoked to guarantee protection for an act Saul himself knew stood outside legitimate guidance. Again, Saul wrapped religious language around a decision born from desperation. At Amalek, sacrifice had been used to defend incomplete obedience. At Endor, an oath in the Lord's name was used to protect a forbidden consultation. The pattern had matured. The woman finally asked Saul whom she should bring up. There was only one answer Saul wanted. Samuel. Not another prophet, not a dead relative, not some legendary warrior from Israel's past. Samuel. The very man whose warnings Saul had repeatedly resisted while Samuel lived. Now that Samuel was dead, Saul desperately wanted to hear him. That may be one of the most tragic reversals in the entire story. When Samuel could confront Saul face to face, Saul argued. When Samuel rebuked him, Saul explained. When Samuel announced judgment, Saul worried about being honored before the elders. But now Saul was willing to risk his life, disguise himself, cross dangerous territory at night, and seek forbidden counsel just for one more conversation with the prophet. He wanted Samuel's voice. But he could not choose what Samuel would say. The biblical account does not treat the coming moment like fantasy spectacle. Its attention remains fixed on Saul the woman and the terrifying message about to be delivered. The woman carried out the consultation. Then she saw something. Her reaction was immediate. She cried out loudly. And somehow, in the shock of what she experienced, she recognized that the disguised man standing before her was Saul. "Why have you deceived me?" she demanded. "You are Saul." The disguise had failed. The king who had hidden his identity could no longer hide. But Saul's concern was not that he had been recognized. He wanted to know what she saw. He told her not to be afraid. Then he asked her to describe it. The woman described a supernatural figure coming up. Saul asked what the figure looked like. She described an old man wearing a robe. The narrative then identifies Saul's conclusion. Saul knew that it was Samuel. He bowed with his face to the ground. The king of Israel was now on the floor before the prophet he had once argued with. The reversal was complete. Years earlier, Saul had met Samuel as a young man, with a future he never imagined. Samuel had poured oil over his head. Samuel had announced his kingship. Now Saul approached the same prophet from the opposite end of his reign. No anointing awaited him, no promise of a dynasty, no instructions for victory, no second coronation. The first words attributed to Samuel are not comforting. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing thee up?" And Saul answered with something close to a confession of total collapse. "I am in great distress. The Philistines were fighting against him. God had turned away from him. God no longer answered him by prophets or dreams." So Saul had called Samuel to tell him what to do. This was the king's crisis in one sentence. The enemy was before him. God seemed silent above him. The prophet was dead, and Saul did not know what to do. But Samuel's response would not give Saul a new strategy. It would not reveal a hidden road to victory. It would not undo Gilgal. It would not erase Amalek. Instead, Samuel would reach backward into Saul's past and show him that the disaster approaching on Gilboa was connected to the warning Saul had already received. The final prophecy was about to begin. And before that night ended, Saul would know what would happen to his kingdom, to Israel, to his sons, and to himself. Saul had finally reached the voice he wanted to hear, but he had reached it by crossing every boundary that should have stopped him. He had left the Israelite camp while the Philistine army waited for battle. He had removed his royal clothing. He had disguised himself. He had traveled through the night. He had sought out a woman whose practice stood outside the lawful means by which Israel was to seek guidance. And after years of resisting Samuel while the prophet lived, Saul was now bowed to the ground because he desperately wanted Samuel to tell him what to do. The biblical narrative identifies the figure before Saul as Samuel. It does not pause to explain the mechanics of the event. It does not provide a detailed doctrine of the dead. It does not turn the scene into a manual for contacting them. Instead, the story remains fixed on the reason Saul has come and the judgment he is about to hear. Samuel's first question struck directly at the contradiction. Why had Saul disturbed him by bringing him up? Saul answered from a place of desperation. He was in great distress. The Philistines were making war against him. God had turned away from him. No answer had come through prophets. No answer had come through dreams. And now Saul wanted Samuel to tell him what he should do. The request sounds almost simple. Tell me what to do. But behind those words stood years of history. Saul had once been told what to do. At Gilgal he had been told to wait. He did not. During the campaign against Amalek he had been given a command. He altered it. When Samuel confronted him, Saul defended himself. When Samuel announced rejection, Saul asked to be honored before the elders. When David rose, Saul was given repeated evidence that David was not seeking to murder him. Still, Saul continued the pursuit. Now, at the edge of the greatest military crisis of his reign, Saul wanted one final instruction, but Samuel did not give him one. There was no new command, no emergency strategy, no secret ritual that could reverse the past, no military maneuver that could guarantee victory. Samuel answered Saul with another question. "Why ask me," he said in effect, "if the Lord has turned away from you and become your adversary?" The words were devastating because Saul had already admitted the same reality. God was not answering him. Saul knew it. Samuel did not deny it. He confirmed the seriousness of it. Then the prophet did something even more painful. He reminded Saul that what was happening was not new. The Lord had done what he had spoken through Samuel. The kingdom was being torn from Saul's hand. It was being given to David. For years, Saul had behaved as though David were the threat. But Samuel now returned the focus to the original issue. David had not created Saul's rejection. David had not caused the command at Amalek. David had not forced Saul to spare Agag. David had not made Saul build a monument for himself. David had not made Saul fear the people. David had not forced Saul to pursue him. The transfer of the kingdom had been announced before David became Saul's enemy. Samuel had said it. Saul had heard it. And now, on this final night, Samuel spoke David's name openly. The kingdom was being given to David. The man Saul had hunted was not stealing the throne. Saul was losing what Samuel had already declared would be taken from him. That distinction matters. Saul had spent years trying to solve the wrong problem. He thought his survival depended on stopping David. But the deeper conflict had always been between Saul and the word he had rejected. The king could chase David through the wilderness. He could send soldiers. He could threaten Jonathan. He could attack priests. He could try to control succession by force. But none of those actions could undo what Samuel had declared. A king may be able to remove rivals. He cannot erase a judgment by killing the person who represents the future he fears. Then Samuel reached even farther into Saul's past. He returned to Amalek. The reason this judgment had fallen, Samuel said, was tied to Saul's failure to obey the Lord's fierce anger against Amalek. Years had passed, battles had been fought, David had risen, Samuel had died. But the unresolved issue remained. The last prophecy did not introduce a completely new accusation. It reopened the old one. That is one of the most important elements in the entire narrative. Endor was not a random night on which God suddenly decided Saul had gone too far. The roots of the disaster reached backward. Samuel's final words were connected to Samuel's earlier warnings. The night at Endor and the confrontation over Amalek belonged to the same tragic line. Saul had once tried to explain that the best animals were preserved for sacrifice. Samuel had answered that obedience was better than sacrifice. Now, with the Philistine army waiting across the valley, Saul learned that the old failure had not become irrelevant simply because time had passed. The king had moved on. The consequences had not. Then the prophecy turned toward the immediate future. Samuel told Saul that the Lord would give Israel together with him into the hands of the Philistines. This was no vague warning. The enemy Saul could already see would prevail. The battle would not end with another dramatic rescue. There would be defeat. And then came the words that transformed military fear into personal doom. Samuel told Saul that the next day Saul and his sons would be with him. The Lord would give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Saul had come to ask how he could survive the coming crisis. Samuel told him he would not. His sons would not. His army would be defeated. The king had traveled to Endor because uncertainty was unbearable. Now uncertainty had been replaced by something worse. A sentence. The biblical text does not record Saul arguing this time. There was no defense, no explanation about the soldiers, no claim that he had obeyed, no attempt to blame Samuel's lateness, no request to be honored before the elders. Saul fell. Immediately he collapsed full length on the ground. The words of Samuel terrified him, and he had no strength. The king had not eaten throughout the day and the night. Everything that had held Saul upright was disappearing at once. Physically, he was weak. Emotionally, he was shattered. Militarily, he faced defeat. Spiritually, he believed himself abandoned. Dynastically, he had just been told that his sons would die and his kingdom belonged to David. There was nowhere left for Saul to hide. The tall man who had once stood above everyone in Israel now lay stretched across the floor. The image is almost the opposite of his coronation. When Saul had first been presented to the people, his height made him visibly impressive. The crowd saw him and shouted for the king. Now no crowd surrounded him, no celebration, no public honor. Only a disguised ruler collapsed in a house at Endor after hearing that his reign was almost over. The woman saw his condition. She approached him. Whatever else had occurred in the room, Saul was now visibly broken. She reminded him that she had risked her life by obeying what he asked. Now she asked him to listen to her. She wanted to place food before him so that he could regain enough strength to continue his journey. Saul refused. "I will not eat." It is a small sentence after such a massive prophecy, but it reveals his state. He had come seeking direction for battle. Now even eating seemed beyond him. But his servants joined the woman in urging him. Eventually Saul listened. He rose from the ground and sat on the bed. The woman had a fattened calf at the house. She quickly slaughtered it. She took flour, kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread. Then she placed the meal before Saul and his servants. The scene slows. Outside, armies were preparing for war. Israel's king had just heard that he and his sons would die, and inside this house there was food, bread, meat. A man being urged to eat because he needed enough strength to walk back toward his army. There is something profoundly tragic about the ordinary nature of the moment. History was moving toward the fall of a king, but Saul still had to stand. He still had to travel. He still had to return to the camp. He still had to face mourning. The woman who had feared Saul when he first entered now served him a final meal before his return. The text does not portray her as celebrating the prophecy, nor does it present Saul as receiving some mystical power from the food. He ate because he was exhausted. His servants ate with him, and then they rose. They left that same night. There was no sunrise of hope waiting at the door. Saul walked away carrying knowledge he had not possessed when he arrived. When he came to Endor, he knew the Philistines were dangerous. When he left, he believed defeat was certain. When he came, he feared for his kingdom. When he left, he had been told that the kingdom belonged to David. When he came, he wanted to know what to do. When he left, no path of escape had been offered, and perhaps most painfully, when Saul came to Endor, he was looking for a new word. Samuel had answered largely by repeating the meaning of the old one. Saul had rejected the word of the Lord. The kingdom had been torn away. Amalek still mattered. David would receive what Saul could no longer preserve. Judgment had not appeared overnight. It had arrived at the end of a long road. The episode at Endor is often remembered because of its mystery. Who exactly did the woman expect to appear? How should the supernatural event itself be understood? Why was she startled? What does the phrase about Saul and his sons being with Samuel imply? Those questions have produced centuries of interpretation. But whatever position a reader takes on the mechanics of the event, the narrative itself keeps one thing unmistakably clear. The point is not that Saul discovered a successful alternative way of seeking divine guidance. The point is that the forbidden journey brought him face to face with the same judgment he had been trying to escape. He did not come away empowered. He did not come away with hidden knowledge that allowed him to defeat the Philistines. He did not gain control of the future. He left knowing that he had lost control of it. That is why Endor must be understood in the larger story. If we begin here, Saul can appear to be merely a frightened king who made one desperate mistake. But Scripture has taken us through years of warnings before bringing us into this house. Gilgal came first. Amalek came first. Samuel's rejection speech came first. The torn robe came first. David's anointing came first. Saul's jealousy came first. The spears came first. The pursuit came first. The massacre at Nob came first. David's repeated mercy came first. Samuel's death came first. Only after all of that did Saul arrive at Endor. The darkness of this night had a history, and now the king had to return to the battlefield. The Philistines did not know what Samuel had said. Israel's soldiers did not know what their king had heard during the night. Jonathan did not stand in Endor beside his father when Samuel announced the coming deaths. Saul would have to carry that knowledge back among them. The text does not tell us exactly what he said when he returned. It does not describe him gathering his sons and explaining every word. It gives us no private final conversation between Saul and Jonathan. We should not invent one. What Scripture does give us is enough. The next movement of the story is toward battle. But before Saul reaches Gilboa, another thread must briefly be understood. David, the man Samuel had named as Saul's successor, was dangerously close to being drawn into the Philistine campaign. David had been living among the Philistines under Achish of Gath. To protect himself from Saul, he had entered enemy territory, and as the Philistine rulers gathered their armies for war against Israel, David and his men were present with Achish. The situation was astonishing. Israel's rejected king was marching toward his final battle. Israel's future king appeared to be marching with the enemy. Had David fought against Saul in this battle, the entire transition of power could later have been interpreted differently. Saul might have died with David's sword somewhere in the chain of responsibility. David's claim that he had refused to kill the Lord's anointed would have become far more complicated. But the Philistine commanders did not trust him. They saw the Hebrews with Achish and objected. Why were these men there? Achish defended David. He said he had found no fault in him during the time David had lived under his protection. But the Philistine commanders remembered the songs. Was this not the David about whom Israel had sung? Saul had slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands. They feared that David might reconcile himself to Saul in the middle of battle by turning against the Philistines. Their judgment was firm. David could not go with them. Achish reluctantly told David to leave. David protested his loyalty in the terms appropriate to the dangerous position he had constructed for himself. But the decision stood. He and his men departed. The Philistine army continued toward Jezreel. David was removed from the battlefield where Saul would die. That matters. The kingdom had been promised to David, but David would not take it by personally killing Saul at Gilboa. The final collapse of Saul's reign would come through the Philistine assault Samuel had predicted. While Saul carried the words of Samuel back toward Gilboa, David was being sent in another direction. Two kings, the rejected king and the anointed successor, were moving apart. Saul toward the battle that would end his reign. David toward events that would soon prepare him to receive news of Saul's death. The future was being separated from the old regime before the final blow even fell. And there is another painful dimension to Samuel's prophecy. Saul was not told that he alone would die. His sons were included. That meant Jonathan. Jonathan, who had once stood against his father's murderous intent. Jonathan, who had defended David. Jonathan, who recognized that David would become king. Jonathan, who had made covenant with the man his father feared. Jonathan had repeatedly demonstrated a kind of loyalty that Saul struggled to understand. He remained Saul's son. He remained an Israelite warrior, and when Israel faced the Philistines, Jonathan would stand with his people. The judgment on Saul's house would therefore carry grief far beyond Saul himself. Not everyone who would fall at Gilboa had walked Saul's path of disobedience in the same way. The biblical story does not allow us to reduce a national catastrophe into a simplistic formula where every person on the battlefield receives an individual explanation for why he dies. War would consume sons, soldiers, families, cities, and a dynasty. The king's failures had consequences larger than the king. Leadership in Scripture is never merely private. The decisions made near a throne can reach people who never made those decisions themselves. Saul had wanted kingship. Israel had wanted kingship. Now the first monarchy was approaching its darkest day. Yet even here the biblical narrative does not say that monarchy itself had no future. The throne would continue, but not through Saul. Samuel's warning had always contained two sides. Something would be taken, and something would be given. Saul's kingdom would fall. David would rise. The death of one dynasty would become the doorway to another. But first, there would be Gilboa. Morning would come. The Philistine formations would move. Israel's soldiers would face an enemy they already feared. Jonathan would enter battle. Saul would enter battle knowing the prophecy. And the words spoken in the darkness of Endor would move from warning into history. Saul had asked for direction. Samuel gave him judgment. There would be no hidden military strategy, no instruction to reposition the army, no sacrifice that could change the outcome, no final act of courage that would restore the rejected dynasty. The message at Endor was not primarily about what Saul should do next. It was about what had already been decided. The kingdom had been torn from him. David had been chosen. Israel would be given into the hands of the Philistines. And Saul's remaining time could now be measured not in years, but in hours. This was Samuel's last prophecy concerning Saul. And it did not stand alone. Every major line of it reached backward into their history. To understand the full weight of what Samuel had just said, we have to hear the final prophecy beside the earlier warnings. Years before, at Gilgal, Saul had faced a Philistine threat. His soldiers were scattering. Samuel had not arrived when Saul expected. The pressure had become unbearable. So Saul acted. He offered the burnt offering. Samuel arrived immediately afterward and asked the question that would follow Saul in different forms for the rest of his reign. "What have you done?" Saul explained the circumstances. The people were leaving. The Philistines were gathering. Samuel appeared late. The situation demanded action. But Samuel told him that his kingdom would not endure. A man after God's own heart would be appointed. That was the first major warning. Then came Amalek. Again Saul received instruction. Again the outward results could be called successful. The enemy was defeated. But Saul spared Agag and preserved valuable livestock. When Samuel confronted him, Saul first claimed he had obeyed. Then he blamed the people. Then he defended the livestock by saying it was intended for sacrifice. Samuel cut through every explanation. Obedience was better than sacrifice. Because Saul had rejected the word of the Lord, he had been rejected as king. And when Saul grabbed Samuel's robe and tore it, Samuel turned the torn fabric into a prophetic sign. The kingdom had been torn from Saul and given to another. That was the second warning. Then David appeared. Saul did not know the exact moment Samuel anointed the shepherd from Bethlehem, but as David's victories multiplied, Saul began to understand. The songs became unbearable. Saul had slain thousands, David tens of thousands. Saul thought there was only one thing left for David to receive the kingdom. From that point on, fear of prophecy became a driving force in Saul's life. He tried to kill David. He used military assignments against him. He involved his daughters. He pressured Jonathan. He sent soldiers after him. He hunted him through the wilderness. He destroyed priests who had helped him without understanding the full political conflict, and yet David repeatedly survived. Worse, from Saul's perspective, David sometimes held Saul's life in his hands and refused to take it. The cave at Gedi should have taught Saul something. The night in the camp should have taught him again. David could have killed Saul. He did not. The threat to Saul's throne was not David's ambition. The threat was the judgment Saul had already received. But Saul kept fighting the human symbol of the prophecy instead of confronting the spiritual reality behind it. Then Samuel died. That might have looked like the end of the prophet's involvement in Saul's story. It was not. At Endor, when Saul finally heard Samuel again, Samuel did not reveal a new reason for the king's downfall. He returned to the old reason. Disobedience, Amalek, the rejected word, the transferred kingdom. Samuel's final prophecy was therefore not merely prediction. It was interpretation. It told Saul why the future was about to unfold as it would. The defeat at Gilboa would not be disconnected from Gilgal. The death of the king would not be disconnected from the rejection of the command. The loss of the dynasty would not be disconnected from the years spent trying to resist its transfer. The final battle was about to make visible what Samuel had declared long before. That is what gives the prophecy such force. Anyone can look at a battlefield after the fighting ends and explain what happened. Samuel spoke before it happened. Israel would fall. Saul's sons would fall. Saul would fall. The army would be delivered to the Philistines, and the next day would bring the fulfillment. Saul now had to return to his troops carrying knowledge no commander would want. There was no indication that his army knew what had happened at Endor. No record that Saul publicly announced Samuel's words. No speech survives in which he told the soldiers that defeat was coming. Scripture does not describe that conversation, so we should not create one. What the text allows us to know is that Saul returned from the night with the prophecy hanging over him. This produces one of the most haunting questions in the story. What does a king do when he knows the battle he must fight has already been declared lost? Saul did not simply flee. He did not abandon Israel and disappear into the wilderness. He returned toward the confrontation. That does not erase what came before. It does not transform his entire life into a final act of righteousness. But it does mean that Saul entered the last battle of his reign rather than running from the army he had been appointed to lead. And waiting near him were his sons. Jonathan was among them. Jonathan's presence makes the coming catastrophe far more painful. Unlike Saul, Jonathan had often responded to David without jealousy. When David defeated Goliath and entered Saul's household, Jonathan formed a deep covenant bond with him. When Saul wanted David dead, Jonathan defended him. When Saul's anger turned against Jonathan himself, Jonathan still refused to become an instrument of murder. And Jonathan understood what his father resisted. David would one day be king. At one point, Jonathan told David that Saul knew it too. Jonathan did not need to destroy David to preserve his own future. He could acknowledge David's calling while remaining faithful to his responsibilities as Saul's son. This is why Gilboa is not simply the story of a bad king receiving what he deserved. It is national tragedy. Jonathan would die there too. So would Saul's other sons fighting beside him. Soldiers whose individual stories Scripture does not tell would die there. Families would lose fathers and sons. Settlements would be abandoned. The Philistines would gain territory. Judgment on leadership could spread through an entire nation. Biblical stories often resist the neat formulas we try to impose on them. Jonathan's death is one reason this story cannot be reduced to Saul sinned, therefore only Saul suffered. Kingship is larger than one person. War is larger than one person. The collapse of leadership reaches beyond the leader. Israel had once demanded a king to fight its battles. Now the failure of its first dynasty would be experienced by thousands. And yet, even in this catastrophe, the larger biblical story was not ending. A transition was taking place. David had been removed from the Philistine battle line. This deserves attention because the timing is extraordinary. David had been living under Achish. The Philistines were preparing to fight Saul. David and his men initially moved with Achish's forces. Had they remained, David could have found himself on the battlefield against Israel, perhaps even against Saul and Jonathan. But the other Philistine commanders rejected his presence. They did not trust him. They remembered exactly who he was. This was the man Israel had celebrated for killing Philistines. They feared he might turn against them during the battle, so David was sent away. David did not decide the final battle with his sword. He would not stand over Saul's body at Gilboa. He would not kill Jonathan. He would not personally destroy the house Samuel said would lose the kingdom. The Philistines dismissed him before the battle began. This created an important separation between succession and assassination. David would become king, but the narrative repeatedly refuses to let him seize that kingship by murdering Saul. Twice David had refused opportunities to kill the king. Now circumstances removed him from the battle in which Saul would die. The kingdom would come to David, but not because David forced Samuel's prophecy to come true. That distinction would become important almost immediately after Saul's death. For now, however, David moved away, while Saul moved toward Gilboa. The two trajectories could hardly have been more different. One man had been anointed, but was not yet enthroned. The other was enthroned, but had been rejected. One moved away from the battlefield, the other moved toward his death. One did not know exactly how the throne would become available. The other had just been told that his end was near. And above both of them stood a word spoken years earlier. The kingdom had been torn away. This is also where Samuel's role becomes remarkable. Samuel himself would not witness the battle in the ordinary sense. He had died before the armies gathered. Yet his words framed the meaning of everything that was about to happen. Samuel had been present at the beginning of Saul's kingship. Now his final message stood at the end of it. He had anointed Saul, he had instructed Saul, he had warned Saul, he had mourned Saul, he had anointed Saul's successor. And in the strange night at Endor, the narrative presents Samuel as delivering the final sentence Saul would hear before the battle. In that sense, Samuel's prophetic ministry forms an arch over the entire monarchy of Saul. At the beginning, you will be king. At the turning point, your kingdom will not endure. After Amalek, you have been rejected as king. At the torn robe, the kingdom has been torn from you. At Endor, tomorrow you and your sons will fall and Israel will be given into Philistine hands. The progression is terrifying because the warnings become increasingly specific. First, the future dynasty. Then Saul's own kingship, then the identity of the successor, finally the timing of the fall. Warning narrowed into fulfillment. But there is another lesson in the progression. Prophecy did not remove human responsibility. Saul was not portrayed as a puppet mechanically walking through a script. At each stage he made decisions. He chose to offer the sacrifice. He chose to spare what had been commanded for destruction. He chose how to answer Samuel. He chose whether to fear the people. He chose how to respond to David. He chose to throw the spear. He chose to hunt. He chose to order violence against the priests. He chose to seek the medium. The story holds divine judgment and human decision together without pretending they cancel each other out. Samuel announces what God will do. Saul remains responsible for what Saul does. This is crucial when we approach Endor. The final prophecy does not mean that everything Saul did before it was meaningless. The prophecy is rooted in those very actions, and the fact that judgment had now been declared did not turn Saul's choices into innocence. The tragic king had spent years making decisions inside the very story Samuel interpreted. Now the time for warnings had almost run out. The armies prepared. The Philistines had strategic advantages. They had repeatedly proven themselves formidable. Israel's forces would soon be pressed on Mount Gilboa. The geography would become part of the disaster. As the Israelite army broke the slopes would not offer Saul a royal escape route from the consequences of defeat. The king who once went out before the people would become one of the hunted. The man who had feared David's weapons for years would be struck by Philistine archers. The father who tried to preserve a dynasty would watch that dynasty collapse on the battlefield. And Jonathan, the son whose future Saul once claimed to defend by opposing David, would die before he could ever inherit the throne Saul had tried to save for him. That is one of the darkest ironies in the narrative. Saul told Jonathan that as long as David lived, Jonathan's kingdom could not be established. But David was never the one who killed Jonathan. Saul's attempt to resist David did not secure Jonathan's succession. The dynasty fell through an enemy Israel had been fighting since before David entered the royal household. Saul had spent years looking toward David. The final blow came from the Philistines. This is how fear can distort judgment. The person Saul treated as the greatest threat repeatedly spared him. The enemy he should have been preparing to confront became the instrument of his defeat. Samuel's prophecy stripped away that confusion. It identified the true shape of the moment. The Philistines would win the battle, but their victory would occur inside a larger judgment already announced through the prophet. And when the battle ended, no one would be able to restore Saul's dynasty by pretending nothing had happened. The old political order was approaching its end. But before the final movement begins, we must notice something else. Samuel's words did not offer Saul the comfort of believing his family would somehow escape even if he did not. The prophecy included his sons. That meant the king would go into battle knowing that the men beside him were also under the shadow of what he had heard. Scripture does not tell us whether Saul warned Jonathan. It does not tell us whether Jonathan knew of Endor. It does not tell us whether the sons saw a change in their father when he returned. And because the text is silent, we should leave the silence intact. Sometimes restraint tells the story more faithfully than invented dialogue. We know only that the next day arrived, the same day Samuel had spoken about. The armies moved, and once the battle began, the prophecy would be tested not in a private room at Endor, but in public history. If Israel somehow won, Samuel's words would appear false. If Saul escaped and his sons survived, the warning would fail. If the Philistines were driven back, the terrifying message of the night would dissolve. But that is not what happened. The Philistines engaged Israel. The Israelite lines began to break. Men started falling on Mount Gilboa. The retreat began. And somewhere in the chaos of the battle, the Philistines closed in on the royal family. Jonathan was there. Abinadab was there. Malchishua was there. Saul was there. The house that Saul had spent years trying to preserve was now standing inside the very battle Samuel had said would destroy it. There would be no more warning after this. No more argument with Samuel. No more torn robe. No more spear thrown at David. No more pursuit through the wilderness. No more night journey to ask what would happen. The answer was happening. And as Philistine weapons found Saul's sons one after another, prophecy began turning into fulfillment. The next day came, the day Samuel had spoken about. There was no longer any darkness at Endor to hide Saul's fear. No disguise, no private room, no whispered question, no final appeal for guidance. Now everything would happen in the open. The Philistines attacked, Israel fought, and the battle turned against Saul's army. The men of Israel began to flee before the Philistines, and bodies fell across the slopes of Mount Gilboa. What Samuel had announced only hours earlier was no longer prophecy waiting for fulfillment. It was becoming history. For years, Saul had fought to preserve his throne. He had guarded it from David. He had tried to control his succession. He had treated the rising popularity of Jesse's son as though David himself were the force threatening the dynasty. But David was not on Gilboa. He had been sent away from the Philistine army. He was nowhere near Saul when the final collapse began. The enemy closing around the king was the enemy that had threatened Israel throughout Saul's reign, the Philistines. And now their pressure became overwhelming. The battle intensified around Saul and his sons. Jonathan fell. Abinadab fell. Malchishua fell. The biblical account gives the deaths in only a few words, but those few words bring an entire royal future to an end. Jonathan would never inherit Saul's throne. The son whom Saul had tried to protect from David's rise would never become king. The man who had loved David, defended him, made covenant with him, and acknowledged that David would one day reign, was killed fighting beside his father against Israel's enemies. Jonathan's death is one of the reasons Gilboa cannot be understood merely as the destruction of a villain. A beloved son died there. A courageous warrior died there. A friend whose loyalty had repeatedly stood in contrast to Saul's jealousy died there. And he was not alone. Saul's other sons also fell. The dynasty was collapsing around the king before Saul himself had died. Samuel's words at Endor had included Saul's sons. Now those words were being fulfilled, one name at a time. The battle pressed harder against Saul. Philistine archers found him. The king was severely wounded. For all the years Saul had feared David, it was not David's sword that struck him. For all the times Saul had hurled a spear toward David, it was not David who returned the weapon. For all the attempts Saul had made to prevent his predicted successor from rising, David was absent. Saul's final enemy came from the battlefield he could not escape. The Philistines had broken Israel's resistance. His sons were dead. The archers had reached him. The king was wounded. And now Saul faced one last decision. He turned to his armor-bearer. Saul feared what the Philistines might do if they captured him alive. He told the armor-bearer to draw his sword and kill him before the enemy could come upon him, abuse him, and make a spectacle of the king of Israel. But the armor-bearer was terrified. He refused. Perhaps he could not bring himself to strike the king. Perhaps the sacred weight surrounding Saul's office remained too great. The text does not explain his thoughts. It only tells us that he would not do it. So Saul took his own sword, and he fell upon it. The first king of Israel died on Mount Gilboa. The man who had begun his royal story searching for his father's donkeys ended it surrounded by military defeat. The man who had once hidden among the baggage because the crown seemed too great now died after years spent desperately trying to preserve that crown. The man whom Samuel had anointed was gone. The armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead. He too fell on his sword. By the end of that day, Saul, 3 of his sons, his armor-bearer, and many of his men were dead. The prophecy had reached its most terrible fulfillment. Israel had been defeated. Saul's sons had fallen. Saul himself had fallen. The Philistines possessed the battlefield. 3 layers of Saul's tragedy now came together at once. The first was military. Israel had lost. The army that Saul had been appointed to lead could not hold its ground. The Philistines had broken the Israelite forces and established control over the field. The second was personal and dynastic. Saul was dead. His sons were dead. The royal house he had spent years trying to protect had been shattered in a single battle. The third was prophetic. Samuel's warnings had proved true. The words spoken years earlier at Gilgal had moved toward completion. The kingdom would not remain securely in Saul's house. The judgment pronounced after Amalek had not disappeared. The torn robe had become more than an unforgettable symbol. The kingdom really was being torn from Saul. And the final message at Endor had been fulfilled with terrifying speed. Warning had become judgment. Judgment had become history. But the disaster did not end when Saul stopped breathing. When Israelites living across the valley and beyond the Jordan saw that the army had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned their towns. They ran. The Philistines came and occupied them. A king's fall affected more than the royal family. Homes were abandoned. Territory changed hands. Communities experienced the consequences of military collapse. The defeat spread beyond the bodies on Gilboa. That is the nature of national catastrophe. A ruler may die in one location, but the shock moves through cities, families, and generations. The next day, the Philistines returned to strip the dead. Battles in the ancient world did not end when the fighting stopped. The victors came back for weapons, armor, valuables, and trophies. Then they found Saul. And they found his sons. The identity of the dead king transformed his body from the remains of another fallen soldier into a symbol of Philistine triumph. They cut off Saul's head. They removed his armor. Then they sent news throughout Philistine territory announcing the victory in the temples of their idols and among their people. The king who had represented Israel's demand for security among the nations now became a trophy celebrated by one of those nations. Saul's armor was placed in the temple of the Ashtoreths. His body was fastened publicly to the wall of Bethshan. The humiliation was deliberate. The Philistines were not merely declaring that they had won a battle, they were displaying the defeated king. The royal body became propaganda. The message was visible: Israel's king could not save himself. Israel's army could not save him. Saul's monarchy had been broken. For Saul, who had so often worried about public honor, the ending is painfully ironic. After Amalek, when Samuel announced his rejection, Saul had asked the prophet to honor him before the elders and before Israel. Public appearance mattered to him. Now his final public appearance was controlled entirely by his enemies. The king who had once erected a monument after victory became a monument to someone else's victory. This is the kind of reversal biblical narratives often use without needing to explain it. Saul had spent years trying to manage how his kingship would continue. At the end, he could not even control what happened to his own body. Yet there is an important detail that must not be lost beneath the humiliation. Saul's story had not begun in disgrace, and not everyone in Israel remembered him only as the jealous king who pursued David. There was a city whose people remembered a different Saul, Jabesh-Gilead. Years earlier, before David, before the spears, before Amalek became the defining failure of his reign, Saul had heard that Jabesh-Gilead was under threat from Nahash, the Ammonite. The people there faced humiliation and devastation. Saul had risen in anger. He rallied Israel. He marched to their rescue. The Ammonites were defeated. Jabesh-Gilead was delivered. That early victory had helped establish Saul as king, and now, at the end of his life, the memory of that rescue remained. When the people of Jabesh-Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, they did not forget. Their response would become the final act of dignity in a story dominated by defeat. But before we reach it, another question needs to be handled carefully. How exactly did Saul die? 1 Samuel 31 gives us the battlefield account. Saul was wounded by the archers. He asked his armor-bearer to kill him. The armor-bearer refused. Saul fell on his own sword. That is the narrative we have just followed. But when the story moves into 2 Samuel, David will receive a different account from an Amalekite man who arrives claiming that he personally ended Saul's life at Saul's request. These accounts should not simply be blended together as though Scripture presents them as the same statement. 1 Samuel reports Saul falling on his own sword. 2 Samuel records what the Amalekites later claimed to David. Whether the man was telling the truth, embellishing his role, or attempting to win favor from the man he expected to become king, becomes part of the next movement of the story. For now, the account in 1 Samuel is clear about the battlefield sequence. Saul died after falling on his sword, and David was not responsible for it. This matters because David's relationship to Saul had been tested repeatedly around the question of taking the king's life. In the cave, David refused. In the camp, David refused. He would not force the transfer of the kingdom through assassination. Now Saul was dead, but David's hands were not on the weapon that killed him. The prophecy concerning David's future was moving forward without David murdering his predecessor. The distinction would become foundational to the legitimacy of what happened next. There is another contrast worth noticing. Saul had repeatedly treated Samuel's word as though it were an obstacle to overcome. But the fulfillment at Gilboa shows how powerless Saul's resistance had ultimately been. He tried to preserve the dynasty. The dynasty collapsed. He tried to eliminate David. David survived. He tried to hold the throne. The throne was emptied. He tried to seek another answer at Endor. Samuel repeated the judgment. He tried to prepare for the Philistine battle. The battle ended exactly in the direction Samuel had announced. Human power had reached its limit. That does not mean Saul's choices were meaningless. It means power could not cancel the consequences of those choices. Saul had armies, a palace, weapons, a royal family, political authority, years of experience. And none of those things could transform disobedience into obedience after the fact. A crown can amplify a man's decisions. It cannot make him immune to their consequences. That is why the tragedy of Saul is larger than the question of whether he was a strong or weak military leader. His greatest crisis was not tactical, it was moral and spiritual. The Philistines defeated Saul's army on one day, but the collapse of Saul's kingship had been developing for years. Gilboa was the visible ending of an invisible fracture. The defeat began long before the archers released their arrows. It began when the king learned to place pressure above obedience. It deepened when he used worship to defend disobedience. It spread when fear of losing power became more important than accepting correction. It consumed him when the future God had chosen became an enemy Saul believed he had to destroy. And by the time Saul reached Endor, the warnings had already been given. Samuel's final prophecy did not create Saul's tragedy. It announced that the tragedy was about to reach its end. This is why the movement from Gilgal to Gilboa is so important. The names themselves almost frame Saul's reign. At Gilgal, warning. At Gilboa, fulfillment. At Gilgal, Saul still had years ahead. At Gilboa, he had hours. At Gilgal, Samuel stood alive before him. At Gilboa, Samuel had already died. At Gilgal, Saul tried to explain himself. At Endor, he collapsed. At Gilboa, there was nothing left to argue. The outcome spoke for itself. And yet, even at the darkest moment, the biblical story was not finished. The death of Saul did not mean the death of Israel. The collapse of his dynasty did not erase God's purposes for the nation. Samuel's prophecy contained destruction, but earlier prophecy had also contained transition. The kingdom would be given to another. David was still alive, and David's response to Saul's death would reveal something important about the kind of king he intended to become. He would not celebrate Jonathan's death. He would not dance because Saul was gone. He would not treat the fall of the house of Saul as entertainment. The throne was opening before him, but the road toward it would begin with grief. Before David received the news, however, the bodies of Saul and his sons still hung in enemy territory. And the story of Saul's reign had one final debt to collect. Far away, the men of Jabesh-Gilead heard what had happened. They remembered the king not only for how he ended, but for what he had once done for them. Years earlier, Saul had marched through the night to save their city. Now their fighting men prepared to march through the night for him. They would cross into enemy-controlled territory. They would approach Beth-shan. They would take down the bodies. And in that final act of courage, Saul, the rejected king, whose reign ended in judgment, would receive one last gesture of loyalty from people who remembered the day he had been their deliverer. The prophecy had been fulfilled. But Saul's legacy was still more complicated than his final failure. And before David could rise, Israel would have to bury its first king. 58. The end of Saul and the weight of Samuel's warning. The men of Jabesh-Gilead remembered. Years had passed since Saul had first come to their rescue. Much had changed since then. The young king who once rallied Israel had become the ruler who disobeyed Samuel, pursued David, and finally died under Philistine attack. But memory is rarely simple. To the people of Jabesh-Gilead, Saul was also the man who had saved them when they were helpless. Now their former deliverer had been publicly humiliated. His body and the bodies of his sons had been exposed by Israel's enemies. So the fighting men of Jabesh-Gilead rose. They traveled through the night. Their mission was dangerous. Beth-shan lay under Philistine control, and the bodies they intended to recover had been displayed precisely because the Philistines wanted their victory to be seen. Removing them was more than an act of burial. It was an act of courage. The men reached Beth-shan. They took the bodies of Saul and his sons down from the wall. They carried them back to Jabesh. There, according to the account in 1 Samuel, the bodies were burned, their bones were buried beneath a tamarisk tree, and the people fasted for 7 days. The first king of Israel had finally been buried. Not in a royal triumph, not beneath a monument celebrating conquest, not surrounded by the future dynasty he had fought so hard to preserve. He was buried by people who remembered an act of courage from the beginning of his reign. It is a fittingly complicated ending. Saul was neither remembered only for his victories nor reduced only to his failures. Scripture had shown both. The king who rescued Jabesh-Gilead was the same king who later massacred the priests at Nob. The man who once prophesied among the prophets was the same man who eventually sought forbidden counsel at Endor. The ruler who could act with courage in battle was the same ruler whose fear of losing power drove him to pursue David. The man Samuel anointed was also the man Samuel eventually declared rejected. The tragedy of Saul is powerful precisely because the story did not begin with a monster. It began with promise. That promise is what makes the fall painful. But the death of Saul did not end the story of Israel's monarchy. It created a vacuum. And far from Gilboa, another man was about to learn what had happened. David had returned from his own crisis. While Saul fought his final battle, David had been dealing with disaster at Ziklag. Amalekite raiders had attacked the city while David and his men were away. They burned it and carried away the women and children. David's own men were so overwhelmed with grief that they spoke of stoning him. Yet David sought strength in the Lord. He pursued the raiders. The captives were recovered, and shortly afterward, news came from the battlefield. A man arrived from Saul's camp. His clothes were torn. Dust covered his head. He fell before David. He reported that Israel had fled from battle. Many had died. Saul and Jonathan were dead. Then David asked how the messenger knew Saul was dead. The man identified himself as an Amalekite, and he told David a story. According to his claim, he had encountered Saul leaning upon his spear while enemy forces closed in. Saul had asked him to kill him because death was overtaking him. The Amalekite said he had done so. Then he presented Saul's crown and armlet to David. This creates an important distinction in the biblical record. 1 Samuel 31 describes Saul as falling on his own sword after his armor-bearer refused to kill him. 2 Samuel 1 records the Amalekites' claim that he personally killed Saul at Saul's request. The text does not require us to silently merge those statements into one account. The battlefield narrative has already given Saul's death. The Amalekite now tells David what he says happened. Many readers conclude that the messenger was attempting to gain favor by presenting himself as the man who had finished off David's rival. Whatever motivated his claim, he badly misunderstood David. He appears to have expected reward. He brought the crown. He brought the royal armlet. He brought news that the man standing between David and the throne was dead. But David did not celebrate. He tore his clothes. The men with him did the same. They mourned, they wept, they fasted until evening. And the text is explicit about whom they mourned. Saul, Jonathan, the people of the Lord, the house of Israel. The battlefield defeat was not good news simply because it removed David's political obstacle. David understood the cost. Israel had been humiliated. Jonathan was gone. The king was dead. Soldiers had fallen. The Philistines had won. This was national grief. Then David questioned the Amalekite. How had he not been afraid to stretch out his hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? The messenger had apparently assumed that killing Saul would make him valuable to David. Instead, his own claim condemned him. David ordered his execution. The future king would not build his legitimacy on celebrating the killing of Saul. Again, the narrative protects an important line. David had refused to kill Saul while Saul lived. And when a man claimed credit for Saul's death, David did not reward him. Then David did something else. He lamented. The song recorded in 2 Samuel is often called the Song of the Bow. David ordered that it be taught to the people of Judah. He did not write a victory anthem over the fall of Saul. He wrote a lament. How the mighty have fallen. The phrase returns through the song. David grieved over Saul and Jonathan. He remembered their strength. He remembered their place in Israel. He warned that the news should not become a cause of celebration among Philistine cities. He spoke directly of Jonathan with extraordinary grief. Jonathan had been more than a political ally. He had been David's covenant friend. The death at Gilboa, therefore, opened the way to David's future while simultaneously taking away one of the people David loved most. Biblical fulfillment is not always emotionally simple. The prophecy concerning David's kingship was advancing, but David did not experience Saul's death as a clean moment of triumph. The crown arrived covered in grief. That matters when we look back at Samuel's final prophecy. Samuel had told Saul that Israel would be given into Philistine hands. It happened. He had told him that Saul and his sons would fall. They did. He had reminded Saul that the kingdom was being transferred to David. After Gilboa, the process accelerated. But even then, David did not immediately rule all Israel. The transition would take time. David went to Hebron after seeking the Lord's direction. There, the men of Judah anointed him king over the house of Judah. But Saul's house did not disappear politically in a single day. Abner, Saul's commander, established Saul's surviving son Ishbosheth over much of Israel. For a period, the land was divided between the house of Saul and the house of David. Conflict followed. The transfer Samuel had announced was real, but history unfolded through stages. Eventually, Saul's house lost its political power. and David became king over all Israel. The throne Saul had tried to preserve for his dynasty passed to the man Samuel had secretly anointed in Bethlehem. The torn robe had become history. But if we stop there, we can misunderstand the lesson. Samuel's final prophecy was not simply a prediction that David would win a political contest. The story is much deeper than two rival kings fighting over power. David did not defeat Saul by outmaneuvering him at Gilboa. Samuel's message had always placed the central issue somewhere else. Saul's downfall began in his response to the word of God. That is why the journey must be remembered in sequence. At Gilgal, Saul was under pressure from the Philistines. He was told to wait. He acted before Samuel arrived and crossed the boundary placed before him. Samuel warned that his dynasty would not endure. Then came Amalek. Saul received a clear command. He carried out much of it, but he preserved Agag and valuable livestock. When confronted, he insisted he had obeyed. Then he blamed the people. Then he appealed to sacrifice. Samuel responded, "Obedience is better than sacrifice." Because Saul had rejected the word of the Lord, he had been rejected as king. Then the robe tore. Samuel declared that the kingdom had been torn away and given to another. Then David was anointed. David rose. Saul became afraid. Instead of accepting the judgment and changing the pattern of his life, he tried to destroy the man who represented the future. He threw spears. He manipulated military assignments. He pursued David through wilderness strongholds. He turned against Jonathan. He ordered the death of priests. And still David lived. Twice David could have killed Saul and refused. Eventually, even Saul admitted what Samuel had already implied: David would become king. Then Samuel died. The prophet's public ministry ended, but Saul's crisis did not. The Philistines gathered. Saul saw their army and was terrified. He sought guidance and received no answer. Then he crossed one final boundary. The king who had removed mediums from the land disguised himself and sought one at Endor. He called for Samuel. And Samuel's final message did not offer a new explanation. It returned to the old one. Amalek. Disobedience, the rejected word, the transferred kingdom. Then Samuel announced what would happen next. Defeat, death, the fall of the army. And the next day Gilboa fulfilled the warning. Seen this way, Samuel's last prophecy is not an isolated supernatural scene. It is the final link in a chain. Gilgal was warning. Amalek was rejection. The torn robe was transfer. David's rise was confirmation. Endor was final declaration. Gilboa was fulfillment. That is the complete movement, and it changes how we understand Saul's tragedy. Saul was not destroyed because he made one nervous decision, nor does the text portray him as a man who never had opportunities. He was warned repeatedly. He sometimes admitted he was wrong. He sometimes expressed regret. He sometimes recognized David's righteousness. He even acknowledged David's future kingship. But recognition did not become sustained transformation. That may be the most sobering part of his story. A person can recognize the truth in a moment and still return to the pattern that is destroying him. Saul said, "I have sinned," more than once. But his fear of people remained. His fear of David remained. His need to control the future remained. His willingness to cross boundaries under pressure remained. The words changed faster than the pattern. And eventually, there were no more warnings left to resist. There was only fulfillment. Yet Scripture also prevents us from turning Saul into a simple object lesson without humanity. Samuel mourned for him. David mourned for him. the people of Jabesh-Gilead risked themselves to honor his remains. Those details matter. Judgment does not require pretending that nothing good ever existed in the person being judged. Saul had courage. He had victories. He had once delivered Israelites in danger. He had been genuinely chosen for a role in Israel's history. The Bible does not need to erase those things in order to tell the truth about his failure. Nor does it need to erase his failure in order to acknowledge his earlier courage. That complexity is part of what makes the account believable and enduring. Samuel, too, should not be reduced to a prophet who appeared merely to condemn. He had invested himself in Saul's reign. He prayed, he instructed, he corrected, he mourned. When God announced Saul's rejection after Amalek, Samuel cried out through the night. The prophet's severity was not the cruelty of an enemy. Samuel was enforcing the very standard that gave Saul's kingship legitimacy in the first place. If Israel's king could simply rewrite divine instruction whenever he wished, then the monarchy would become exactly what Israel had been warned about: human power without proper submission. The king stood under God, not above him. That principle outlived Saul. It would confront David. It would confront Solomon. It would confront kings throughout the divided monarchy. Some would listen to prophets. Others would resist them. Some would repent. Others would harden themselves. Eventually, entire kingdoms would fall after generations of warnings. In that sense, Saul's story became an early pattern for the history that followed. A throne did not guarantee divine approval. Military strength did not guarantee permanence. Religious ritual could not substitute for obedience. And prophetic warning was not meaningless simply because judgment did not arrive immediately. Sometimes the interval between warning and fulfillment was mercy. Time to respond, time to change, time to stop. Saul had time, but time alone does not produce repentance. The question is what a person does with the warning while there is still time to hear it. There is also a final misconception worth correcting. The lesson of Endor is not that Saul discovered a secret spiritual method that gave him access to knowledge otherwise unavailable. The scene ends in the opposite direction. Saul gained no power from it. He gained no escape. He gained no victory. The consultation did not overturn divine judgment. It confirmed it. The most important words Samuel spoke that night pointed not toward hidden mysteries, but toward the moral history Saul already knew. You did not obey. The kingdom has been given to David. The battle will be lost. The mysterious setting should never distract from the painfully clear message. The real horror of Endor was not that Saul encountered something strange. It was that he finally heard the answer he had spent years refusing to accept. The throne was over. And yet the promise moving through Israel's history was not over. Saul fell, David rose. David himself would fail in serious ways, proving that Israel's deepest need could never be solved by finding a flawless human king. Still, the covenant connected with David would become one of the great threads running through the rest of Scripture. Later prophets would speak of a coming ruler associated with David's line. The New Testament would present Jesus as the Son of David and the promised king. That larger development does not turn every detail of Saul's fall into a direct prophecy about Jesus, but it does show why the transfer from Saul to David matters beyond one generation. A dynasty ended, another began, and the biblical story continued moving forward. Samuel did not live to watch David sit on Israel's throne. Saul did not live to see the kingdom fully united under the man he feared. Jonathan did not live to stand beside his friend when that day came. But Samuel's words survived all three of them. That may be the final image to carry from this story. Samuel was buried. Saul was buried. Jonathan was buried. The armies moved on. New kings rose, generations passed. But the warning remained. Power cannot make disobedience harmless. Religious language cannot turn rebellion into obedience. Fear cannot secure a future God has already placed beyond human control. And delaying judgment is not the same thing as canceling it. Saul began as a king surrounded by promise. He ended on Gilboa, beneath the weight of warnings he had never truly learned to obey. Samuel's voice was finally silent. Saul's throne had fallen. But the words Samuel had spoken did not fall with them. If this complete story changed the way you understand Saul and Samuel, tell us in the comments which biblical figure or prophecy should receive the complete documentary treatment next. Subscribe to continue exploring Scripture as one connected story, and continue with the next documentary to see how Saul's fall became the beginning of David's reign.